I am Evelyn Zumaya, the author of Astral Affairs Rambova, and I want to read my book to you. The story. Exordium. The death of Claude Falls Right. Pearl Lagoon, Nicaragua, March 1926. Rain pelts the muddy grave, sending rivulets onto the mourner's sodden shoes. A matronly woman and two safari-outfitted men stand graveside under a single umbrella, drenched around their edges. Before them, a Pearl Lagoon fisherman fidgets with his straw hat in hand. Unfazed by his torrential baptism, he eulogizes. Señor Right, it was no good what happened to him, Señora Eleanor. Que Dios le bendiga, Señor Right. Eleanor Brenneman weeps with the rain, her sobs not going unnoticed. Her son Edgar and deep trance medium Georgewehner stand by, consoling. How dismal an end for Claude, whispers Edgar as a gust of wind threatens the umbrella. Oh, Edgar, enough, you're making it worse, shushes Eleanor. How she suffers, the scenario far surpassing all limits of her withstanding. Remaining steadfast despite, she summons every resolve to honor the final resting place of her dear friend. Eleanor Brenneman arrived in Pearl Lagoon with Edgar and Georgewehner earlier that day, aboard a banana freighter from New Orleans. The Pearl Lagoon locals greeted them by jostling to be the first to tell them about the dire state of affairs on the Brenneman plantation, located a few hours north along the Wawashang River. They also shared the news of Claude Wright's death, several times and in sorry detail. Despite some discrepancies in the grisly tale, one detail was consistent. The torso of the American gentleman's body washed up on Pearl Lagoon's riverbank. The discovery of his remains came as little surprise to the citizens of Pearl Lagoon. Reports of the volatile situation on the Brenneman plantation reached them long before Claude Falls Right ever arrived. The townsfolk warned him not to adventure north along the Wawashang alone, advice he should never have ignored. Before embarking on his fatal trek, Claude Wright spent a week in Pearl Lagoon, organizing his expedition to the plantation of his fellow Manhattan theosophist, Eleanor Ray Brenneman. As a member of the executive committee of the Theosophic Society of America, Claude accepted the mission enthusiastically on Eleanor's behalf. He would not live long enough to file a single report from the Nicaraguan jungle. If the crocodiles had not left his remnant, there would have been no explanation for his disappearance. My poor, poor Claude, Eleanor weeps on graveside as Edgar continues his hand-patting. George struggles with the umbrella. As the effort makes him feel faint, his vision blurs. The relentless rain sparks a moment of trance for George, and he surrenders to the gathering ethers. In that discarnate moment, he hears Claude Wright's death throes and the thrashing of those crocodiles devouring their meal. George gazes into the mists to see trails of vapor writhing up from Claude Wright's grave as serpentine apparitions. In an instant, they slither away over the muddy field like tongues with something desperate to say. "Are you all right, George?" Edgar asks. George inhales a long breath to return to consciousness. "Now, Edgar, I am, yes." Over the next few days, Eleanor Brenneman ensured Claude Wright's grave received its dignified commemoration. She also met with Pearl Lagoon notables to establish a memorial foundation in his name, which could be used to benefit children. Eleanor stayed on in Pearl Lagoon for 2 more weeks, while Edgar and George traveled through the jungle by horseback to resolve the labor problems on her plantation. Georgewehner never met Claude Falls Right and embarked on this journey only as an interlude of psychic service executed within his professional capacity as a deep trance medium. The details of Claude Wright's death, the trek by horseback with Edgar along the Wawashane River, George knew precisely how it would all transpire because he predicted it all a few months prior in a seance in Manhattan. Claude Falls Wright's demise was not the only death Georgewehner predicted that year. Within a month of his return from Nicaragua, he would travel halfway around the world in the opposite direction to the French Riviera, where he would prophesize the death of silent film icon Rudolphvalentino. Chapter 1. The Ousting. 7 months earlier, in August of 1925, on an eastbound train crossing the American prairies. The morning panorama is lost on Natacharambova, Mrs. Rudolphvalentino. If she does cast a glance, the American heartland streaking past the train's window appears as a blurry background to her deep in thought. She is still arguing with her husband Rudy, who was by then more than 1,000 miles behind her in Hollywood. Natasha scowls at the white linened table before her, spread with an array of fragrant pastries, a small pot of tea, her ivory cigarette holder, and matching case. She has been up since dawn and long before her travel companions, her Aunt Teresa and Rudy's business manager, George Ullman. The train rattles across a trestle, issuing a long whistle as it speeds over the river below. The August air is stifling and prompts Natasha to crank the window lower. Despite her refined surrounds, she is not admiring any vista. She is tormented by words and more words she wished she'd said before leaving Los Angeles, vexed by regret and still determined to have her say. She glances at her wristwatch with its thinly cut moonstone dials sparkling in diamond adornment, a Christmas gift from Rudy a few years earlier. Not long ago those diamonds would have inspired love for her husband. Today she whispers, "I'm buying a new watch." Natasha opens her cigarette case, makes a selection and presses it into the cigarette holder, striking light. The smoke wakes Aunt Teresa, who stirs in a curtained compartment nearby. She yawns as she arrives to sit down across from Natasha. "How long have you been awake, dear?" "For hours," her niece answers. "Well, go back to bed. Read something to take your mind off things." Natasha stands to take her aunt's advice as George Ullman enters the car. He appears exhausted, despite a night's rest. Staging Natasha's departure from Los Angeles meant long hours for him throughout the past week. His tough work week was further exacerbated by Rudy's ill temper. The dissolution of his marriage to the woman he still clearly loved had him in a very bad mood. George Ullman rubs his eyes and resets his eyeglasses. "Good morning, Teresa. Do you have another letter for me to mail at the next station, Natasha?" "No, I do not." Natasha greets him by wrapping her robe tightly around her waist and snapping, "I won't write him another word." She turns and heads toward the sleeping compartment. Aunt Teresa waits a moment before saying to George Ullman, "When we get to Manhattan, you must find her representation. She cannot continue in this state." I will," George responds, taking a seat to gaze out the window. The silence of their breakfast is interrupted only by the noise of the train clacking on across the countryside, taking them closer to New York City, and a hopeful ceasefire in Rudy and Natasha's bitter domestic warfare. Natasha kept her word, and her final letter to her husband was sent the day before. It was a lengthy letter of frantic confessions, knowing each one would further enrage. Again, she asked Rudy why she was being exiled for a brief liaison with a cameraman, when he entertained beautiful co-stars in his bungalow on the United Artists studio lot every day. Again, she argued how cruel he was to sign a contract with United Artists denying her a role in his future films. She raged as she wrote that last letter, asking how dare he hire detectives to follow her. Natasha falls back to sleep that morning, unaware her marriage to America's most swooned upon matinee idol has effectively destroyed her Hollywood career. Any perspective is obscured by the fresh trauma of their parting. As her last letter wends its way towards Rudy, Natasha dreams of retaliation for such a brutal abuse of her art and soul. Natasha Rambova met Rudolphvalentino in 1920 when she interviewed him for the lead role in Evelyn Zumaya's production of Camille. As the film's art director, costume, and set designer, Natasha approved Rudy's candidacy, and he was hired on the spot. She would later recall it was not, for her, love at first sight, but Rudy's persistent wooing paid off. She felt an affinity with his loneliness and found his inability to tell a joke to be endearing. Journalist Herbhowe would recall the first time Rudy mentioned Natasha to him. And I quote, "Rudy was lonely. I never knew a lonelier man. He craved affection so. I remember the first time he spoke Natasha's name to me. We had had dinner in his one-room kitchenette apartment in the Formosa. He had engaged a woman to come and serve for the occasion, and it was wistfully festive. I had done the first stories about him, and he was deeply grateful. Rudy showed me some of his first notices proudly. While I was waxing fervent over his prospects, he tentatively mentioned the name of Natasha Rambova. Had I heard of her? I hadn't. She was doing some really remarkable sets, he said. He thought her a fine artist. She's a wonderful girl, very much alone like myself. I go to her house evenings and we talk about things that interest us, things that don't seem to interest many people here. Books, new plays, the modern art movement, and of course our work. Our tastes are very similar." End quote. It was not long before Natasha returned Rudy's romantic advances, and they began living together in a small bungalow on Hollywood's Sunset Boulevard. Their love affair complicated because Rudy was then still a married man. When he moved into Natasha's cozy bungalow, he and his wife, actress Jean Acker, were separated but not divorced. Despite having no divorce papers in hand, Rudy considered his marriage to Jean effectively over. She infamously rejected him on their wedding night, and they never shared a single bed together. A scorned Rudy moved on from his wedding night rejection to soon enjoy his wild success on screen. This inspired his wife Jean to delay divorce and instead hire private detectives to spy on her husband as he carried on with his new love and mistress, Natasha Rambova. When Natasha and Rudy fell in love, she was the bigger star in Hollywood, having worked as a costume and set designer on movies with Cecil B. DeMille and Evelyn Zumaya. Rudy's first hit feature, The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, had yet to be released. He would not be granted status as a household name until his signature film, The Sheik, premiered in the fall of 1921. Rudy and Jean Acker would finally divorce in early 1922, and believing the divorce final, Natasha and Rudy married in Mexicali, Mexico. This marriage was quickly annulled when the Los Angeles County District Attorney brought charges of bigamy against Rudy. It seemed Rudy's divorce from Jean Acker stipulated he wait 1 year before remarrying. The fact his marriage to Natasha took place in Mexico did not alter the court's ruling and only served to give the appearance that Rudy and Natasha were attempting to circumvent the law. The court ruled their Mexicali marriage invalid and stipulated they endure a 1-year separation before remarrying. They would marry again in March of 1923 to live at last as husband and wife. Throughout this time, Rudy welcomed his wife's artistic input in his popular movies, and in a spirit of eager collaboration, Natasha assumed the role of her husband's creative advisor. As her influence intensified, Rudy's screen performances were artistically elevated, and the quality of his films received emphasis. However, this caused some of his fans to grumble and resent her very presence. In the 1920s, social dictates deemed a wife's place in the home, and there primarily in the kitchen. With Natasha's notable absence of apron, iron, and frying pan, she was above all perceived as a poor wife for Rudolph-Valentino. Although photographs of her exuding a general ennui did not win her a legion of fans, this image belied her behind-the-scenes reality. Those who knew Natasha remember her as a happy woman with an easy laugh. She received high praise for her artistic contributions to her husband's film in trade publications, but was nevertheless often the target of theater audiences' disapproval. Rudy's employers exploited their angst. They believed unrest might remedy one challenge they faced in marketing heartthrob Rudolph Valentino. For the moguls, there was enticing potential in allowing Rudy's fans to believe he was unhappy in his marriage, thereby nurturing their sympathy and dreams of being his. Press releases were issued implying he took female fans to his dressing room, and throughout the Valentino marriage, the motion picture industry portrayed Natasha as a lovely yet persistent thorn in Rudy's attractive side. Their innuendo cast her as self-serving, aloof, and cold, while directing all compassion towards Rudy. Natasha would recall, and I quote, "Rudy had pride, a legitimate man's pride, and they worked on that. They commenced bringing him clippings which said, 'Mrs. Valentino wears the pants. Too bad Rudy can't be his own boss,' and so forth and so forth. These rankled. Eventually, if I so much as observed it was a nice day, Rudy, about to agree with me, would catch himself and say, 'No, it's not.' Of course, I realized how he felt. He didn't want to be putty, even in his own wife's hands. We would laugh about the clippings. Nevertheless, they made a wedge." End quote. Rudolph Valentino's rise to international stardom over those few short years is in great measure due to his successful collaboration with and the artistry of his wife Natasha. Unfortunately, their partnership would be short-lived. Rudy was a traditional man in regards to the subject of domesticity, and as much as he appreciated and respected his wife's artistry, he also wished for her to stay home, bear and rear his children. For Natasha, the pressure of producing Rudy's movies and his offspring loomed large, and as a world of women swooned over her husband's every move and openly pined to take her place, her marriage rocked towards a tumultuous end. Seeking solace and counsel during their troubled times, Rudy and Natasha delved into spiritualism, participating in seances and automatic writing sessions. Natasha believed Rudy possessed psychic ability, and she spoke publicly about his growing reliance on two spirit guides. Blackfeather, an American Indian, dispensed advice about Rudy's daily life, and Mesalope, an ancient Egyptian, shared direction of a more arcane nature. Georgewehner explained, and I quote, "It must not be thought that Valentino was superstitious in any small and trivial way. He had no objection to spilling salt, walking under a ladder, whistling in dressing rooms, beginning a picture on a Friday, or sitting down with 13 at a table. These things he ridiculed. The psychic never became a religion to him, but he yielded to its mesmerism more than to any other form. This was entirely due to the influence of his wife, who was a firm believer in the occult and initiated him into its mysteries." End quote. Rudy was further initiated into the occult mysteries by his friend screenwriter June Mathis and her mother Virginia, or Jenny. Both mother and daughter Mathis encouraged Rudy's immersion into spiritualism, as they were ardent believers in life after death and communication with the deceased. When Jenny died in 1922, she allegedly communicated with her daughter June and with Rudy during one of his automatic writing sessions. Natasha was so convinced of Rudy's psychic talents, in 1923 she encouraged him to publish a small book of his psychic poetry titled Daydreams, with publisher Bernard McFadden. Natasha explained to McFadden how Rudy channeled the poems as they were transmitted to him from famous deceased poets via his two spirit guides, Blackfeather and Mesalope. She went on to explain how the mysterious initials opening each poem revealed the identity of the famous author transmitting from beyond. Bernard McFadden published Daydreams, which became an immediate bestseller. Throughout 1923 and 1924, seances, automatic writing sessions, and heeding the advice of deceased spirit guides became Rudy and Natasha's daily de rigueur. And I quote Affairs Valentino. Under intense harassment by his fans and the press, Rudy found welcome solace in any altered state that allowed him to feel safe from outside intrusion. As he became more proficient at slipping in and out of a trance and writing lengthy directives from his master guides while in a state of semi-consciousness, the barrier between his troubled earthly world and his peaceful astral plane grew thinner. End quote. Storm clouds first threatened the Valentinos' marriage during the filming of his movie Monsieur Beaucaire in 1924. As the movie's art director, Natasha oversaw many aspects of the lavish production, and her demands decimated the film's budget several times. This sparked frequent arguments between Rudy and Natasha. When Monsieur Beaucaire premiered, many fans attributed Rudy's overall lack of action to Natasha's influence. Although Monsieur Beaucaire would be heralded as her artistic masterpiece, the future of Rudy and Natasha's artistic collaboration seemed doomed from then on. He would subsequently sign a contract with United Artists, eliminating her from any role in the production of his films. She reacted furiously and considered the contract the fatal blow to their marriage. In a gesture of appeasement, Rudy and George Ullman agreed to fund and produce a movie she would write and produce titled What Price Beauty. The movie was based on the lengths to which women go in search of beauty and a man's dilemma in choosing between the love of a simple woman and the appeal of a glamorous bombshell. George Ullman implored Natasha to first secure a contract, securing distribution, or run the risk of having no audience for her film. Proceeding despite this caveat, What Price Beauty went into full production in the spring of 1925. Meanwhile, Rudy and Natasha's arguments grew louder and longer, and their home often tense and silent in the aftermaths. As Natasha's mother, Winifred Hudnut Muzzy, would recall, and I quote, "It seemed rather hopeless for us to smooth over the difficulties between these overtired and temperamental children. They were both too proud, too hasty, and impetuous." End quote. Throughout the summer, Rudy spent most of his time in his United Artists bungalow, and Natasha most evenings away from home working on What Price Beauty in her own beach bungalow she leased as hideaway. In a peak of paranoia, Rudy hired private detectives to follow her and capture any evidence of infidelity. The first report from the detectives informed him Natasha spent an afternoon alone with What Price Beauty's married cameraman, D.J. Jennings. When confronted, Natasha denied infidelity and was outraged over Rudy's invasion of her privacy. This instigated a final showdown between Mr. and Mrs. Valentino, which resulted in their dramatic separation. Rudy asked George Ullman to establish a new production company to serve as his corporate alter ego, one which would eliminate Natasha from any future role in his business. When informed of Rudy's demands, Natasha did not hesitate to sign on every dotted line. On the day of their scheduled parting, Natasha met with George Ullman to sign away her business partnership with Rudy. They then all motored to the train station to convince the press They were merely embarking on an amicable marital vacation. Headlines blared news of the Valentino separation, and speculation was rife. It was widely reported Rudy instigated the split because Natasha refused to bear his children. He did not discourage the rumor when he told the press, and I quote, "There is no plan on my part at this time to consider a marriage to anyone else. The time will come probably, but it is far off. When that time comes, I shall choose to have a wife whose tastes are thoroughly domestic and who is inclined to have children." End quote. Rudy and Natasha said their goodbye in a display of nervous giggling for the benefit of gathered press and newsreel cameras. Despite the fanfare, she was furious and could not leave Los Angeles fast enough. And Rudy seethed, believing he was the cornuto, the betrayed. As Natasha leaned down for a last kiss, no one present that day realized this would be their last kiss and the last time they would ever see each other. Chapter 2. The Love of Her Life. Manhattan, August 1925. By the time Natasha, Aunt Teresa, and George Ullman arrived in New York City, it was impossible for them to avoid the press or their reports. Newsboys waved their papers high as they yelled the tale of the sheik's separation. Magazine stand owners stacked their fresh copies, and the New York Evening Graphic's bootjacks bellowed the news up and down Broadway. In nearly every article, Natasha was portrayed as the difficult wife who refused to bear Rudy's children. As much as Natasha outwardly comported herself as a dignified, estranged wife, inwardly she was already on her defense. On August 24th, she summoned press, stood alone before a table strewn with letters from Rudy, and announced she was going to write a tell-all book about her failed marriage. Ridiculous captions spread the word of her plan, with one claiming she left the sheik because she was sick and tired of eating spaghetti. Anticipating the scandalous expose, reporters badgered Natasha with questions about Rudy's public appearances in Los Angeles, with his Hungarian co-star Vilma Banki on his arm, and his citation for speeding, with the charge of driving under the influence. For Aunt Teresa and George Ullman, Natasha's distress with the coping was painful to witness. George Ullman would recall one exchange with Natasha shortly after their arrival in New York, and I quote, "I do not mean to imply that Natasha had definitely given up all hope of reconciliation, for I recall one morning when I went out to see her about 10 o'clock, she appeared in a white negligee gorgeously embroidered in gold, with her luxuriant hair braided in 2 long loose braids down her back, her face pale, her eyes delicately ringed from a sleepless night, and her whole attitude one of wan dejection. I was determined to question her definitely to see if I could find out what she really thought and what she proposed to do. 'Do you really love Rudy?' I asked. Twisting her hands together in a small voice, she replied, I don't know. 'Do you want to go back to him?' I don't know. 'Do you want to get a divorce and lose Rudy out of your life forever?' She paused at this and stared at me with her great eyes full of woe. 'I don't know,' she faltered, and then burst into a flood of tears, whereupon I knew no more than when I began to question her, nor, am I convinced, did she. Before George Ullman boarded a train home to Los Angeles, he negotiated a contract for Natasha with Harry J. Cohen, former manager of the Foreign Department of Metro Pictures Corporation. He also negotiated a second contract for her with Daniel Carson Goodman, the head of production at FBO Pictures, Film Booking Offices of America Incorporated. Daniel Goodman was developing what he felt to be the perfect film vehicle for Natasha, a movie based on a story by Laura Jean Libby titled Do Clothes Make the Woman? Harry Cohen closed the deal for Natasha's appearances in the movie with J.I. Schnitzer, vice president in charge of production for FBO Pictures. Filming was scheduled to begin on November 15th on the East Coast, guaranteeing no unpleasant return to Hollywood for Natasha. Her screen debut as an actress would be in a modernization of Laura Libby's story with a script adapted by John C. Brownell. Do Clothes Make the Woman provided Natasha with an immediate excuse to travel to France, ostensibly to purchase a wardrobe for the film. However, she would sail for France with the intention of filing for a divorce in Paris. Natasha returned to New York City aboard the SS Leviathan, which sailed from Cherbourg, France on Election Day 1925. She arrived with 40 trunks of the newly purchased clothing for Do Clothes Make the Women, and still fuming over her failed marriage, she announced, and I quote, "In Paris, I did it. I applied for a divorce. Rudy said that when I was ready to cook and keep house, he would take me back. Fancy that. He would like to keep me basking in his reflected glory." End quote. Upon her arrival in Manhattan, she learned Rudy was also in the city for the opening of his latest film, The Eagle. Although their paths would nearly cross by a few city blocks, neither made the slightest attempt to contact each other. Filming began on Do Clothes Make the Woman within days of her return, with the movie being directed by Harry O. Hoyt and British actor Clive Brook cast to star opposite Natasha. She held every reason to believe this would be her big break into an acting career, and told one reporter, and I quote, "My whole life will be devoted to my career. I want to be a successful actress. By that I mean a success in other ways than merely financial. When I come on stage, I do not want to be thought of as Mrs. Valentino, wife of the Sheik. I want to be considered as a young woman who's trying desperately to become a success." End quote. For Natasha, this drive for success as a single woman meant hyperactivity. She not only worked on the FBO set of Do Clothes Make the Woman, she engaged in a variety of activities and at a frenetic pace. She told one reporter that fall she was writing a novel and authoring a comprehensive book on costume design, this while designing the wardrobe for an upcoming Broadway show. She was also delving deeper into the occult and began attending a gathering of like-minded acquaintances who called themselves the Bamberger Circle, or the Saturday Nighters. The group convened in the home of Mrs. Harry Bamberger, a glamorous New York socialite who hosted the circle with the purpose of holding seances and studying all aspects of spiritualism and theosophy, or the wisdom religions. The regular members of Mrs. Bamberger's circle included Natasha, her mother Muzzy, 3 mediums, Alpha Gabriel, a medium and inspirational speaker, Marian Epstein, who specialized in automatic writing, and Georgewehner, a deep trance medium. Mrs. Leopold, Mrs. Harry Bamberger's mother, also attended, as well as Marian Hover, the 2 women referred to as the Joys, Dr. Gervon, Ernst Strauss, Albert Mulliday, the editor of Aviation magazine, and a stenographer. The Saturday Nighters acted primarily as seance sitters for the mediums, who created the ambience depending on their individual process and the spirit guides they summoned. Natasha was enthralled by the Saturday Nighter experience, and it was not long before she announced she was hosting her own seance. By December 15th, after 1 month of filming, FBO Pictures announced their 7-reel film starring Natasha Rambova. It was being cut and edited. The announcement also revealed a title change to When Love Grows Cold, and the star of the film was not billed as Natasha Rambova, but Mrs. Rudolphvalentino. The ploy to exploit her newsworthy divorce infuriated Natasha, and she protested, fearing the title change implied she was profiting from her divorce. She did not wish to give the impression the film was a true representation of her marital situation. FBO ignored her complaints and proceeded to launch promotional material for the movie in trade journals, specifically marketing the film with tips on how to entice audiences by using the name Mrs. Rudolphvalentino. Quote, Natasha, of course, means nothing, but Mrs. Rudolphvalentino, her name in private life, is something else again. End quote. Natasha's final days of retakes on the FBO set were completed under protest, and she focused her attention on the planning of her first seance. Throughout filming, she confided in her co-star Clive Brook and director Harry Hoyt, sharing her enthusiasm over those weekly seances at Mrs. Bamberger's. They were consequently not surprised when she invited them to attend the seance she was organizing. Both men initially demurred, but Natasha insisted by arguing they might in the least find the experience educational. So you sit in a circle in the dark and commune with the dead? Clive Brook asked. That depends on the medium's spirit guides, Natasha replied. Then what I might hear will depend on the spirit guide the medium summons from the other side, Natasha explained. Each medium acts as a vehicle for those spirits, but mediums do not choose who will speak through them. So, if I do accept your invitation, Natasha, who might I expect to hear from during your seance? I don't know, Clive, as I have yet to book a medium. If it is Alpha Gabrielle, then you will hear inspirational voices. If I retain Marian Epstein, you will hear from the Indian spirits she calls her fun makers. Or perhaps you shall hear from her guide, Frida. If I am able to have Georgewehner conduct this seance, then you will hear from the American Indian chief, White Cloud. Well, Natasha, Clive blustered, White Cloud, Frida, you have me curious. I'll go. Chapter 3, Black Carpeting. Manhattan, December 1925. Georgewehner did not trust show business folk, and he considered them to be tremendous phonies. It was for this reason he hesitated to respond to a memo left on his desk. Natacharambova phoned with a request he conduct a private seance. George thought initially to refuse her invitation, wishing to keep his affiliation with her within the gatherings at Mrs. Bamberger's home on Saturday nights. He changed his mind only after his spirit guide, the American Indian chief White Cloud, insisted he do so. George's faith in the spirit voice of White Cloud was implicit, and had been his entire life. Consequently, it was only a minimal hesitation before he returned Natasha's call and scheduled a seance. Georgewehner was then a sought-after psychic who catered to those A-list Manhattanites reveling in the trend of occultism. Without a doubt, his panache in all things seance had taken him comfortably far in his otherworldly trade. His personal appeal certainly contributed to his success. He was a handsome, slightly built man, 5 feet 5 inches tall, 34 years old, with a businesslike demeanor. Despite his suspicion of celebrity, George was well received by the well-known. Within a few days, George finds himself knocking on the front door of Natasha's penthouse apartment at 9 West 81st Street. Any hesitancy he might have felt accepting her invitation vanishes the moment the door swings open. George is mobbed by a pack of yapping tiny dogs as a butler takes his hat and coat to turn and make the announcement over the ruckus. Mr. Georgewehner has arrived, Madame Rambova. Natasha appears to make her memorable impression. She is dressed in a tightly wrapped purple satin floor-length gown and an extravagantly long Persian brocade housecoat of gold and silver lame, which is lined in a brilliant red fabric matching her signature turban. George works his way through the panting pups to greet Natasha and enter a grand room to be immersed in the exotic. Black carpeting spreads wall to wall, creating a plush canvas for the room's eclectic appointment of pale gray walls, silver-painted woodwork, and oversized modern furniture upholstered in black velvet. George greets Natasha and her mother Muzzy, who is reclining on one of the black velvet sofas. Muzzy wears a clinging gown of jade green and a diaphanous duster of rose and gold velvet. Extending her bejeweled hand to George as if in some royal gesture, she eyes the quizzically dressed medium from his Western-styled shirt with its pearl buttons to his shiny black cowboy boots. Natasha introduces the other seance participants, or sitters, to George: Clyde Brooke, Harry O. Hoyt, and Natasha's friend and chanteuse, Donna Shin Russell. George surveys the room and slips away for one moment. He steps up a wide stair to exit through two high French doors, which are draped in yardage of vermilion velvet. Swinging the doors open, he steps out onto a topiary terrace, twinkling with the lights of Central Park and the city beyond. He pauses to turn and observe the movements of those gathered inside, their gestures, choice of clothing, and auras. Within a few minutes, Natasha beckons for George to join her in the room she's prepared for the seance. A dining room, replete with a chandelier crafted in the shape of a morning glory blossom, laced with tendrils spiraling low over the center of the table. George is pleased with the setting, its glittering crystal display and polished lacquer. "Would this be to your satisfaction?" Natasha asks. "Oh, Natasha, it's perfect. But the lighting must be precise, as you know. Can we dim the chandelier?" Natasha beckons for the butler. "Yes, George, certainly." In New York City in December of 1925, the services of spiritualists, adept in a variety of occult activity, could be retained to satisfy every price range. It was a precipitous time to be a psychic, as the hiring of someone to commune with the dead on your behalf reached the height of popularity. The timing of this phenomena has historically been attributed to the catastrophic loss of life during World War I. Over 18 million people died as a result of the global conflict, leaving millions more as relatives and loved ones of the fallen. Vulnerable in their grief and desperate to commune with deceased family members, the stricken sought comfort in the presence of mediums and psychics who claimed they could channel the dead. From the more serious mediums, such as Georgewehner, to gypsies camped on a street corner, the other side practitioners were making good money as the astralplane became an acceptable and popular destination. Egyptologist Howard Carter's discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922 charged these dabblings in the afterlife with the added intrigue of new mysteries from the land of the pharaohs. The desert sands and all things Egyptian contributed in great measure to the growing acceptance of crystal balls, tarot cards, and seances. The author of the Sherlock Holmes crime fiction detective series, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, announced he was a true believer in the occult and openly endorsed spiritualistic activities. He owned a bookshop in London where he sold occult reading material and founded the Hampshire Society for Psychical Research. For Sir Arthur, his psychic research was of world significance, as he felt spiritualism to be a new revolution, one that would bring comfort and peace of mind to people mourning the loss of loved ones. The spiritualist movement was not without its adversaries, with American magician and self-appointed anti-spiritualist crusader Harry Houdini advertising his ability to defraud mediums. Of course, this provided advertising for his own act of illusory escape tricks. The debate raged between Houdini and Doyle, which served to further intensify popular interest. If you were not someone convinced occult behavior was the devil's handiwork, you were undoubtedly sitting in seances, gazing into a crystal ball, or having a fortune teller read your tarot cards in a small tent or a darkened room. The lure of the mysterious gripped America's imagination, with the occult contributing to the roar of the 1920s, as equally as embraced as a flask of bootleg whiskey or a bathtub full of homemade gin. Occult activities varied according to one's social status, with certain practices deemed more respectable than others. The genre of spiritualism embraced by Natasha, Muzzy, Mrs. Bamberger's Saturday Nighters, and Georgewehner reflected their social status. They alleged to approach the entire subject as students, and their involvement to be psychic research. They made it clear they were not merely seeking a sensational result or a hair-raising display. By assuming this superior and academic posture, they avoided the pitfall of being perceived as common, or worse, of being accused of being devil-worshipping witches and warlocks. George's caliber of mediumship allowed him to cater exclusively to Natasha and Muzzy's haute world, with his impeccable style contributing to his professional charisma. According to all first-hand reports, he was convincing and graced the homes of his clients with the elegance of a prince, a psychic prince, with a penchant for well-tailored suits, Western apparel, and cowboy accessories. In Natasha's dining room, preparations for her first seance continue, as the butler dims the morning glory chandelier. Natasha, Muzzy, Clive Brooke, Harry Hoyt, and Donna Russell take their seats around the table. George shares a few instructions before he relaxes into his chair and closes his eyes. With the sitters as witnesses in the darkened room, his head drops back, his mouth agape. His breathing slows as he snores slightly. Natasha and Muzzy are familiar with his process and lead the sitters in reciting the Lord's Prayer in unison. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. George begins to roll his head side to side. He claws feebly at his throat with his right hand and seems to pant. The sitters continue with the incantation. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. George startles the gathering by sitting bolt upright and opening his eyes to stare into the room's shadows. He begins whistling a soft, wavering melody. After a few minutes, his whistling stops, and he relaxes again into his chair, eyes closed. To the uninitiated sitters, George appears to have just fallen asleep. Natasha and Muzzy know this signals his spirit's departure from his body. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. The booming voice of White Cloud then speaks through George, greeting the sitters one by one. In his broken English, he then ushers in other spirits he acknowledges on the astral plane who wait to deliver their messages to the sitters. George does not pause between their messages and segues from one spirit to the next, while speaking in a free-flowing monologue of changing voices. In just more than 1 hour, the spirits have all spoken. George draws a deep breath and opens his eyes. This signals the end of the seance. By the reaction of the sitters, George felt his first seance for Natasha to have been an, quote, extraordinarily fine one, and he was able to transmit meaningful messages for everyone except Muzzy. Natasha wept, being so moved by George's performance, and insisted he cancel all bookings to hold seances for her alone. Muzzy would not be disappointed for long, as George held a private seance with her the following day. She was astounded by the accuracy of his messages, and relieved he had nothing but positive projections for her daughter's future. This was especially reassuring, as Muzzy was prepared to sail to France the following day, and the uncertainty of Natasha's emotional well-being was foremost in her mind. She was so calmed by George's positive outlook, she surprised him with an invitation to sail with her to France. She tried to convince him to visit her and her fourth husband, cosmetics tycoon Richard Hudnut, at their grand chateau on the French Riviera. She could think of no finer place to channel the dead than high over the harbor at juanlespin in the Mediterranean Sea. George would disappoint Muzzy, explaining he had a prior commitment to conduct a series of seances for the American Society for Psychical Research. Although he was unable to accept Muzzy's offer, George knew well an affiliation with Natasha Rambova her mother and Richard Hudnut could be a gold-gilt opportunity for him professionally. He was above all ambitious and cultivated his high society clientele with finesse. Finesse and a gift of flawless gab, tinged with enough knowledge of the gab's recipient to mystify consistently. Despite Georgewehner's subsequent and dominating presence in Natasha Rambova's life from the fall of 1925 until 1930, he has remained in the shadows of her life story. This occult phase of Natasha's life was no whim, and Georgewehner no mere footnote. He was a deep trance medium in which she held complete confidence and trusted as a devoted travel companion. For as fate had it, Georgewehner bonded with Natasha when she was at her most vulnerable. Mourning the loss of her marriage to Rudy and bitter over her Hollywood debacle, Natasha embraced the medium's uplifting presence and ethereal consultations. Despite her abrupt exodus from Hollywood, Natasha still reigned as the icon of high fashion, and her divorce from the chic provided unending fodder for gossip columnists coast to coast. Contributing to the furor, the producers of When Love Grows Cold timed their movie's release with precision by premiering the film just as news of the Valentino's divorce became headlines. With the added interest of Rudy's new blockbuster film The Eagle opening in theaters, he and Natasha owned the headlines. Unfortunately for Natasha, most of the reams of news reportage continued to be hostile towards her, and she grew distressed as she was called, quote, everything from Messalina to a dope fiend. When asked if she was affected by the name-calling, she replied, and I quote, I was tortured to agony. Natasha was cast firmly into the role of divorce perpetrator, and Rudy's adoring public heaved all blame for the failed marriage on her. She did not bear the onslaught well. As she sought a path into her future, one leading far away from all things Hollywood, and a disassociation from her life as Mrs. Rudolphvalentino, she grew morose over her wide-spreading negative reputation. Georgewehner, as remedy, happened along at the opportune moment. But was he a gifted psychic, an authentic medium as he claimed to be? Or was he an actor, an opportunist who wielded his charm to exploit and engage the vulnerable? Was he a Rasputin, a Svengali who hypnotized and seduced the distraught Natasha Rambova into believing she needed his constant presence? How much of an influence did he have over her during that time of her life? Perhaps most intriguingly, did he predict the death of Natasha's beloved Rudolphvalentino? Conversely, was it Natasha who beguiled George? Was he so impressed by her beauty, her cultured demeanor, and social status that he abandoned his role as professional medium to become her companion and someone she relied on unequivocally? Who beguiled who? And who was Georgewehner?